Okay, welcome friends. You are in the right place. This is In the Beginning, the early days of women's studies at the University of Washington. This event is co-sponsored by Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies and the university libraries. As attendees, you're invited to engage in a respectful manner in our chat box. Ask questions of the panelists using the Q&A function. To send messages to all of the participants and attendees, please make sure you check the To field on your chat box so that your messages go to your intended audience. Our session is being recorded and the chat will be saved as well. And then I have to read the standard no name calling, slurs, or cyberbullying. We don't expect that. Not abiding by this rule will result in removal from the webinar. GWSS acknowledges the Coast Salish peoples living in the unceded lands, touching the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Duwamish, Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. Our work aims at creating spaces for previously displaced or ignored ways of knowing. And at this point, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I will turn over the webinar to the chair of Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies, Dr. Shirley Yee.
Thanks, Cass. And thank you, Cass and Karen Wang for the UW Libraries for helping us with the technologies and putting all of this together for our webinar today. Also, thank you to Monica De La Torre, one of our own PhD students who is going to be helping with the chat later on. As Cass says, my name is Shirley Yee, Chair of the Department of Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies, and I'm just delighted and honored to serve as moderator of today's panel. As many of you are aware, this event is part of our week-long celebration of the 50th anniversary of Women's Studies, now GWSS, at the University of Washington. As of you know, our celebration began this past Monday with Dr. Beverly Guy-Sheftal as this year's Walker Ames lecturer, whose lecture was entitled Say Her Name, The Urgency of Black Feminism Now. It's available in case you missed it through the UW Grad School. So please, if you haven't seen that fabulous talk, please do. In addition to today's webinar, we also welcome you to view several more events. Online, just go to our website at GWSS at UW, and you will see a list of different links for events this week, videos, and also another webinar on Friday at 4:30 by the Women of Color Collective. So those are really special events, and I hope you'll have a chance to view them. We also have our short video available on Friday afternoon, which provides a brief overview of the history of women's studies, now GWSS at UW. Okay, so just a couple of notes to share with you. I'm really delighted to tell you that even now, as we speak, there's my colleagues who are putting together works about women's studies and GWSS and feminism. And two that I'd like to shout out. The first is Dr. Julie Shane, my colleague at UW Bothell, whose book came out, I believe, about a year ago, an edited collection called Persistence is Resistance, celebrating 50 years of gender, women, and sexuality studies. And that is in open access. So please, if you haven't already, take a look at that fantastic collection. The second text is forthcoming by my colleague at Brooklyn College, Dr. Barbara Winslow, who is finishing up her book on feminism in Seattle. And there are references to Women's Studies at UW there too. So please, if you have a chance, read those books. So for those of you in the audience who don't know the history of our department, we began as a program actually in 1971, although as the panelists will tell you, the first course was actually offered in the spring of 1970. The program is one of the oldest in the United States, perhaps even the world, and definitely in the Pacific Northwest. The program became a department in the mid-1990s, during which we offered an independent major and prepared for an eventual graduate program. And our graduate PhD program began in 1999 with the first cohort of grad students. So we are beyond the 20-year mark, actually, for the graduate program. But many of you may not have heard any of the stories from folks who were around actually at the very beginning and inception of the program. And so we're honored to introduce 5 women who were students and activists at UW during the late 1960s, early 1970s. So before I introduce briefly all of them, during the first hour, we'll hear their stories, which are just rich and wonderful and inspiring. And then around 4:30, we will end the panel discussion and we'll open it up to Q&A. So we look forward to that. So our guests today include Julie Coriel, who co-developed with Anne Suisel Herendell the first course in Women's Studies called Women 101 in the spring of 1970. We have Dr. Mary Logan Rothschild, who was a graduate student in history and became the first acting director of the program in 1971. Claire Bright was a grad student in philosophy during the 70s, and many of you know Claire. She's taught Lesbian Lives and Cultures, taught for the honors program, and a longtime supporter of and steadfast supporter of the department and a mentor of mine. And we have 2 former students, Lexi Evans, who was a student in the 70s, who just, I think, recently retired as Dean of Student Life at Seattle Central College. And last but not least, Karen Rudolph, who was also an undergraduate, came to UW to study women's studies, actually, and went on to earn a law degree, run a business, and is intensely active in Native American activism. So I think that's everybody. I have a sort of a list of general questions that I thought we would begin with. One is to hear the stories, to begin to hear the stories of those of you who were around in the beginning, and tell us a little bit about how you became connected to the program in one way or another. And I'd like to start actually with Mary Rothschild, who's a grad student, in the late 60s, and became the first acting director before moving on to Arizona State University. So Mary, why don't you start us off? How did you become involved? You have to unmute yourself first.
Sorry about that.
Okay.
I became involved because Alden Bell, who was the Associate Dean in charge of General and Interdisciplinary Studies, known as GIS, asked me in the fall of 1970, fall quarter, if I would like to be the graduate student representative on a new committee that was going to decide whether or not there should be a women's studies program at the University of Washington. And I said, sure. I mean, that sounded like fun. And he also, at the same meeting, asked me if I would like to teach a class on US women's history. Now, there were no classes on US women's history anywhere in the West, actually, at that time, not just at the UW. And I said, with the arrogance of youth, sure. I mean, I was writing my dissertation. I'd finished all my exams in US history for my doctorate. Surely I could, you know, I really believed, give me 3 weeks, I could teach anything. So, and now he was giving me 2 quarters, right? It wasn't until spring of 71. And that launched me on my entire intellectual career and path for my whole life. And so it was utter serendipity, and nothing about my life, my academic life, was planned. And I can't imagine having a richer or more exciting academic life than being in the very beginning of Women's Studies, which was only called Women's Studies at the University of Washington because Dean Dorothy Strawn, who was the Dean of Women, we had deans of women in those days, said, because everybody else was calling it Women's '(S) Studies, and she said, no, it doesn't belong to women. It is about women. You wouldn't say Blacks Studies. And so that's why we started with as Women's Studies. And of course, our committee very quickly, these committees usually took 3 to 4 years to come up with a decision. Ingrid Dierith Olsen, who was an amazing woman, full professor in zoology, chaired the committee, and she was inexorable. My then husband said, standing up against Ingrid is like being run over by a glacier. It's constant, it's slow, and it's inexorable. You will be destroyed. And Ingrid, who was lovely, despite that description, got us to come up with the recommendation by June. We had our first meeting the first week in, sometime either in October or the first week in November, and by June we had a positive recommendation and a course study for what this new degree would be. And so the dean had to accept it. There was sort of no way out for him. Alden Bell was completely in favor of it, but the actual full dean was not so much. But that was that. And we then became the second women's studies program in the United States. The first was at San Diego State. We graduated the first graduate at the UW. So it was a blessing of my life to be involved.
Thank you, Mary. And we'll certainly come back to more stories when we make our rounds. Julie, you developed the first course before the program started in the spring of 1970. And actually, you were not a graduate of UW. You had moved to Seattle with your husband, and you were doing all kinds of activist stuff. Tell us a little bit about how you came to develop that class. You have to unmute yourself.
Thank you. I'm glad to back up a little bit. I'm going to start close to the beginning of my life. I'm going to be brief, but I want to lay a groundwork here. In my 3rd year, my father left the pilot reactor at Oak Ridge, Tennessee for the chemistry department at MIT. My poet mother named me and then Element 61 and honed my love of language. At the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, Chinese characters in serene Buddhas captivated me. I grew up in Lexington, Massachusetts, steeped in stories of the revolution and transcendentalism, Fission daughters and sons of liberty. At college, I resisted Western bias to study Chinese language and history. My father's scientific discussions of reproduction, my mother's love of bodies, and humor in navigating my dating girded my choices. Like my seatmate in 8th grade who dropped out of school for becoming pregnant, I had choices. 6 weeks after my mother died, 2 weeks after graduation, I married Seeley. I returned for a master's degree as the Cultural Revolution in China powered up, studying how peasant science impacted agricultural yields. So I came to UW in 1969 as a trailing spouse. Seeley joined the oceanography department at UW. And I began volunteering in the office of the Dean of Women, Dorothy Strawn. And the experience opened my eyes. I helped collate the dissertation questionnaire for a sociology graduate student on the experiences of women who had a longer trajectory, but variable onsets and variable access to completing a degree. And that, of course, was the awakening of women's liberation. I met, now here, Associate Director of the University of Washington YWCA. That Y divorced from the men and became a locus in the U District on the Ave, with a gay lesbian resource center, abortion birth control resource center, menopause study group, then a Radia clinic, then Mechanica promoted women in trades. When the Dean of Men supplanted her as Dean of Students, Dorothy Strawn moved to continuing education. In 1969, she supported my paid teaching, Feminist Perspectives on Children, and then in the winter of the feminist movement, fall 69 and winter 70. She enlisted General Studies Dean Alden Bell, whose leadership of interdisciplinary studies made possible an innovative course for 4 quarters, not including summer, bypassing what Mary alluded to, the interminable grinding of the wheels administrative procedure. 3 of us, actually, myself and Shuiso, who changed her name to Arundel after deciding to go to law school and retiring from the UW. It's the French for swap from the Awakening by Kate Chopin. But we had a third, Dr. Judith Shapiro of the economics department, who was not granted tenure. And I want to say that Dorothy Strawn moved to continuing education because Dean Root became, from male dean, the Dean of Students. And but had enough credentials to be paid and to create 101. My father used to, Julie, when you want to learn something, you look for a course to take. Well, as Mary alluded to, finding no courses on suffrage, birth control, women in the law, I found we made the course, and it grew an entire curriculum, a program, and by the mid-90s, a department its own. So I'll see more as conversation develops, but, and I do have one minor correction, but that's what history is about. Mary Eisenbach was not granted tenure in the Department of Economics, so to give her a year to find another position, she was appointed acting director of Women's Studies, half-time and half-time in the economics department. And it was she that invented the appointments on Women's Studies. She was an incredible person. She had served in the diplomatic corps and learned the advantages that married people in diplomacy have, because their children, they're informal working, not available to single women working in the field. So you also remember the environment of the universities didn't have women faculty. They were not welcoming open places. And Judith Shapiro went on to the London School of Economics, and I've lost sight of her. But the thing about Women 101 is each week developed a different topic, as I said, women in the law, and laid the groundwork that Mary and the developers of the program, for administratively and for an ongoing problem. We were the pioneers, but they were the continuers, and you need both.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. Thank you so much. So we're getting a sense of both the curricular and the institutionalization of the program in that early time. So I would thank you very much, Julie. I would like to move on to Lexi and Karen. You are students in the early 70s. Can you tell us a little bit of what it was like to be an undergraduate at UW? Karen, let's start with you.
So I came to University of Washington in 1974 because I had taken a course from Mary Rothschild at University of Puget Sound. I had been a US history major and basically had learned nothing at all about any woman in history. It was all the great man kind of course of history that I'd been taking. And I loved it so much. I mean, Mary was an unbelievably fabulous teacher. And I loved it so much that I decided I'm going to transfer up to UW in 1974. Of course, at that time, the big question always was, what are you going to do with a women's studies degree? You know, and I didn't care. You know, I just knew that that's what I wanted to study. The other thing, so I'm going to talk about what it was like being a student. And later on, I went on to teach Introduction to Women's Studies numerous times, once with Lexi. But to be a student, we had a Women's Studies student union, and the department was basically run by the advisory board or the advisory committee. And on that board were students, staff, instructors, and professors. And we were all equal because we were not just interested in the content, you know, the research into women's things or, you know, what was being taught. We were interested in the form, in a feminist form, and in creating, in the university, in creating a feminist department that wasn't just about the information, but was how we were with each other. You know, and we used to, the motto was, of course, sisterhood is powerful. And this was unusual. I mean, it's hard to imagine now, but professional women who were famous often were quoted as saying that they did not have any women friends, that they only had men friends, and they were only interested in having men friends. And women were seen as being in competition with each other. You know, you wouldn't have women friends because, of course, they might be after the same man that you were after. So we were flipping that on its head and saying, no, what's important to us is our women friends, the women in the department, and the faculty and the staff and the students. We all felt like we were all contributing equally. We had lots of potlucks. A lot of the students lived in households that were all women's studies students, you know, 5 or 6 women together. It was a little community within the big UW community that, you know, you could always go hang out in Paddleford and run into your buddies. And we weren't, as students, we weren't afraid to take on the professors, you know, in meetings, to state what we thought was important and to make our own demands. The thing is, you know, I learned a lot of content, but what carried on through my life, and I'm now 68, what carried on was those lessons I learned about looking at the form that something, you know, that contained things. You know, how did I owned, for years, I was one of the owners of a large commercial construction company in Northern California. And when I got power in that company, you know, I looked at, okay, what's the form here? How are people treated? What's the hierarchy? Is it a patriarchal form? Is there a way I can make it more matriarchal? So that was really important to us. And that's what I ended up carrying with me. I don't think that, well, maybe it was the intention of the department, but it definitely was, you know, what a lot of us carried. A lot of the students, probably most of the students at that time, were coming from activist communities. You know, we had history in the anti-war movement. We had history in the women's movement outside of the university. And so we had connections with, with Native American fishing rights struggles. And we were, you know, what they call accomplices. You know, we were out there marching, taking El Centro de la Raza. I was close friends with Raul Salinas, who was an ex-convict Chicano poet who was teaching in Chicano studies. Good friends with Michael Smith, who was a student at Native American Studies and went on to run the American Indian Film Institute in San Francisco. We were friends with the Filipino socialists, KDP, you know, who were fighting for the workers in the canneries and in the fishing industry up in Alaska. So we had all those connections. And it was great when I started teaching, well, Intro to Women's Studies, because, you know, there was unlimited amount of different people that would come in and talk to the class kind of as favors, you know, to us. So, and in Women's Studies, I learned from Yolanda Alanez, I learned about the forced sterilization of Native American women and Chicanas. And that awareness, you know, because she said, you guys are always talking about abortion rights, and this is what's happening to us. You know, we're losing our right to have children. And I started working on that issue, and it actually led to my, you know, the next 40 years, 50 years of working with Native American people. Anyway, so that's part of what happened. So I wanted to tell one story before I turn it over to Lexi. I was taking Claire Bright's feminist philosophy class, or philosophy of feminism. And it happened to be, because we didn't have a women's studies building, you know, where all the classes were taught. So this was taught up on the second floor of this building that was happened to have the aeronautical department, which I had never heard of, but there they were. And next door to Claire Bright's class was a little office that belonged to the aeronautic students, where they would hang out, you know. And we would have to walk by their door every day. And when we looked in there, because their door was open, the whole room was completely wallpapered with pictures of naked women, Playboy and Hustler pinups, fold-outs. And we got tired of this, you know? So one day before class, Debbie Oppenheimer and Valerie R. Morgan, and I can't remember who else, and me, we went in to talk to the women that were, I mean, not the men that were sitting at the desk in their little private room that they had. And we told them we really objected to having to see this all the time. And they basically told us, you know, they didn't care, and we needed to leave. And Valerie Morgan, and we continued the, you know, rational conversation we were having. Actually, there were 2 men and 1 woman student in there. And she was like, oh, it's not a problem, you know, for her. And I thought, yeah, because, you know, you have to play with the boys in order to get ahead in your field. But Valerie Morgan started just ripping the pictures off the wall and stomping on them on the ground, tearing them up. So at this, the male students totally freaked out, and they went running out, and they went and found one of their professors, who was an old gray-haired man. And he came in, and he was livid, very angry at us. And this was the days when, you know, there had been sit-ins at buildings. So, you know, people were still concerned about radical students. So he got really upset with us, and he said he was going to report us, you know, to the administration, and that we were going to be expelled for this violence, ripping up these pictures. And he pulled out his pad and pencil and said, "What's your name? I'm taking down your names." Because this is in the days before, thank God, before iPhones and being able to take pictures and videos. So Debbie Oppenheimer told him that her name was Emma Goldman. We took the cue. I said I was, Susan B. Anthony. Valerie Morgan said she was Elizabeth Cady Stanton. He carefully wrote these names down. We spelled them for him. And then he left and we left. But we were scared that we were going to, that somehow we were going to get caught. And so we knew we could not come back into that building again for the class because they might be waiting for us. And so we went to Claire and asked her if we could please just turn on our papers and not attend the rest of the class. It was not too many sessions left. And she said, yes, of course, because she didn't want us to get kicked out of school. So that was kind of an example of the kind of things, that we learned how to speak truth to authority figures, or maybe not truth, because I really wasn't Elizabeth Cady Stanton, but so on to you, Lexi.
Thanks, Karen. I've known Karen since we were on the Women Studies Student Council together. She never wore shoes. It's just marvelous to see you. Well, in the early 70s, I had just barely arrived in Seattle from Montana, and I had a kind of a schizophrenic view of myself. I thought I was really tough in some ways. And I had taken some classes at Seattle Central. In fact, I had forgotten all about this till we started talking. I had taken a class on women in literature. And it was Anna Karenina, Madame Bovary, all novels by men about women. I mean, actually, they're marvelous novels, but I still had to meet Sidney Kaplan before I actually was studying the kinds of things I wanted to study. But Seattle Central was then and now, a hotbed of political activism. And so I had encountered, the Black Panthers were centered there, and not that I actually hooked up with them, but I did meet some activists, and that led me to join a rap group at the University Y. So consciousness raising group, which we still called rap groups. And it was moderated by this lovely woman, Sharon Kalin, who I think you may remember. And I think she was teaching Women 200 at that time. So because of, two different things happened to me in that rap group. One was that I was able to transform from just an irritated person into a feminist. And also she walked me over to campus because I really thought I could take on Seattle Central, which was really a much more daunting environment, but not the University of Washington. But it was very close. We walked over, and I registered for school at the University of Washington and started taking. Well, for one thing, I took a class from Leslie about women's literature, or not Leslie, Sydney. That class that Sydney taught, I think, Karen, you were in it. And Leslie Cossett, which is what popped in, and Cecile Andrews. It was just all the burgeoning feminists in Seattle were sitting in in that one English class. I mean, it happened in other classes, but that just happened to be the first one where, and people that I've now known for 50 years were reading Virginia Woolf with Sydney. And I was fortunate. I was just blessed to meet those people and to begin to see a completely different, not only a view of my future, but a view of the future of the world, that things could be looked at in a completely different way. I had a dinner party about a week ago, after my little group of friends here had all been 2 weeks since our second shot. So I had a party and assigned everyone the task of coming prepared to talk about some woman that they admired or who had inspired them. So everybody, these are Montana women, so they all talked about pioneer women, mostly from Butte. And I talked about Mrs. Hamer, Fannie Lou Hamer, and this marvelous, incredibly well-educated and very smart and exciting woman at the other end of the table said, "Lexi, how did you find out about her? How do you know that story?" And I realized, I mean, anybody can read about Fannie Lou Hamer if they want to, but my life got changed in women's studies because not only did I start to learn about women's history, but I developed a brand new lens for how to look at the world, a completely different way of thinking. What are the pieces that fit together here to make things, to bring things to this point and to get us ready for the future? I think I mentioned Sidney Kaplan, but Karen and I might have even been in this. Oh, I wasn't in that class where you beat up the aeronautics students, but I took philosophy of feminism from Claire, and it changed the whole way that I analyzed knowledge and news. I mean, I was never the same person again in terms of how I thought and how I analyzed and judged things. And I think that, you know, I went on to have a really interesting life where I could influence a lot of students. And the methods and the goals that I had in doing that were completely different than they would have been if I had just emerged with an English literature degree. So I'm so grateful to have been there, and I feel that I really made good use of what I gained there. So thanks.
Thank you both, Karen and Lexi. And I'd love to revisit the community formations of women that existed at that time. But right now I'd like to turn the mic over to Claire, because Claire, you were a grad student, and then in the late 70s took a turn at being chair or director of the program.
Okay.
Experience.
Well, in the early 70s, I was a graduate student in the philosophy department at the UW, and inspired by the second wave of feminism, when it came to pick my dissertation topic, I chose ideologies of the women's movement. Well, the reaction from the all-male faculty was decidedly negative. And surely I wasn't suggesting that feminist theory was in any way real philosophy. So it was quite discouraging to me. And it wasn't just in that department that those attitudes were around. They were around in the whole field of philosophy and a number of other fields as well. So I was having a pretty hard time with it. But then I started hearing rumors of something called Women Studies that was beginning on campus. And I just gravitated to that idea because of my situation. and I went over to the Women Studies Advisory Committee and asked if they would like me to teach a course called Philosophy of Feminism. Now, a little did I realize what I was getting into. You've heard from Lexi and Karen, wonderfully challenging students, and I mean that in the best possible way. So my spirits were greatly lifted by their enthusiastic response to having me teach for the program. And I continued to do that for the rest of my doctoral studies. And really it was the support from the women's studies community that helped me get through the rest of getting that degree. And I'm so grateful for that. And when I did get my degree, I then got a job in Minnesota and teaching women's studies. So obviously the women's studies program at UW was completely key to my having an academic career for the rest of my life. And I just want to say that I think that my experience really exemplifies what was going on with women's studies at that time, the challenges, because it simply wasn't even considered legitimate scholarship. It was definitely mocked. Feminism was considered a silly fad that would fade away. And sexism was just an illusion conjured up by a bunch of frustrated, angry women. So the work was cut out for us. And I think it's amazing how far women's studies has come through the 50 years of this program and this department to be where it is now. So.
All right. Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Claire. And, you know, Claire's last comment and what the rest of you were alluding to is the kind of curriculum that was emerging in the program at that time. Lexi, you mentioned Sydney's Kaplan's class on literature and philosophy of feminism, and then Mary teaching history. And Julie, you know, beginning with Julie's 101 class. What were some of your favorite classes? Do you remember, besides maybe the ones that you've already mentioned? Do you have any favorites? You don't have to remember the title.
Wasn't there Psychology of Women?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What was her name?
Julie Herrick, who later became Breyer, taught women in the law.
Pat Luneburg taught women in psychology, was very supportive to the program.
Mm. And Carolyn Allen taught women in literature too.
Mm-hmm. There was a really nice selection of literature classes, because there were a lot of literature. Women faculty were interested and positive. Oh,
hands. Mary and then Julie. Go ahead.
The difference in departments made a difference in how fast women's studies got started. English had a lot of women, not a lot, but English had women professors who then started, and Sydney Kaplan was brought in to do women's, she had done her dissertation on women authors. In my department, in history, I mean, I want to say this because I think it's very hard for students now to even begin to imagine what it was like when I was a student. I was the only person in, the only graduate student in American history, and the UW's strength in the history department was, and it was well known, was in American history. I was the woman in American history. I was at the UW because I did my undergraduate degree there and my master's and my PhD. I was at the U 10 years in the history department. I had one woman professor in sociology. That was it. And she was fired the next year. She didn't get tenure. She was a fabulous teacher, but she didn't get tenure. She actually went to Washington State and did get tenure, I'm happy to say. But it was almost impossible unless you were in a quote unless you were in English or social work or nursing or education, to have women professors at all, regardless of your discipline. And now I don't think there's a student who could get through a university degree without having multiple women professors. I mean, so when I taught my first class, I didn't know what the hell I was teaching. I really literally spent 20 to 30 hours in research for every hour of class that I taught, because there would be like 7 paragraphs in a book or a chapter, or I mean, and I'd had nothing before. I mean, nothing. So when I first proposed the course that I was asked to teach, I called it A History of Women's Rights and Feminism. And it was very focused on suffrage and activism and abolition. And
So fabulous.
even that was really hard to get the material on. And when I was teaching it for GIS, but I had it mimeographed back in the day of mimeograph in the history department. And 2 of the professors, when I was picking up my syllabi for the first quarter, saw the front page of it and it said A History of Women's Rights and Feminism. And they said, oh, well, that could actually be history. And clearly it had never occurred to one of them, except maybe my thesis director, that what I was doing was in any way actual history. And it's really hard to even begin to imagine now what it was like then. It was so new, it was so powerful, it was so transgressive, and yet so profoundly exciting. And I was married at the time. I was married actually for a long time, but I was married when I started in Women's Studies, and I was pregnant with my first son, who turns 50 in July. And and that was unusual, because these were the days, if you were in women's liberation, which I by then was, it was smash monogamy, smash the state. I mean, nobody was choosing to get pregnant, but I did choose to get pregnant. Anyway, so I'm pregnant with Toby and teaching my first class, and people were saying, how are you going to do that? And as a joke, somebody said, well, you could go in barefoot the first day. And I mean, it was just seen as so completely bizarre. And yet it took off so fast. And the last thing I want to say about that particular time was, once I started researching that class, which I did in October, I started in October and barely got it together, class by class. I suddenly was in a rage, an absolute blinding rage that this had been withheld from me for my entire life. And that rage made me not very easy to live with, I think, but it did give me a lot of energy. I mean, unbelievable amounts of energy to do this work. But it wasn't just that I was angry at American education and my professors in particular. I was also angry at myself. I was smart. Why had I sat in classes and not raised my hand and said, what the hell were 50% of the human race doing now? That I had never challenged this, that I had bought that the world was only about men, was profoundly upsetting to me. And so the rage I was more angry at my professors, but I was also angry at myself for not being reflective, for not thinking, not challenging them. Anyway, it was an extraordinary experience to be involved at the beginning.
One thing like in teaching the introduction course was a lot of students got angry, when they opened their eyes up to what we were saying, and they got very angry. And so we had to work into the course a way to deal with that. you know, and our way of dealing with it was, even though the class had like 100 people or more than 100 people, was one day a week we would break into small groups, the same small group, so that people would have, you know, 6 or 8 women usually, who were their cohort, that they could talk to about what the information they were learning was doing in their private life or their professional life.
Yeah.
So they would have that kind of support. And the class was credit, no credit, or pass, fail. And that was one of the reasons for it, was because we wanted people to have the time and energy and the freedom to deal with, you know, their whole self, not just the intellectual part, but the whole self. So they could talk in the small group. They kept journals that their group leader would read and write notes back to them on. But, you know, that was the form of the education, which was very, probably still is, totally not typical at the university, was that kind of whole person education.
Thank you. Thank you, Karen. Julie,
Yeah,
go ahead.
I'm muted, not muted. I'll lower my hand. A positive thing, I'm still married to the man I married, and he's a science fiction fan. In fact, he started writing science fiction in his retirement and having a wonderful time. But he asked me, Julie, back in Women's Studies, earliest days, why don't you have a course on women in science fiction? Well, I'm not a big fan of science fiction. I read a lot of books. He's a faster reader than I am. I read a lot of left-hand pages of novels. But I did encounter Left Hand of Darkness, Ursula Le Guin, 1964 or 66, where the characters choose to become male or female. And so 2 graduate students, Vonda McIntyre and Susan Anderson. Susan was in comparative literature and Vonda in biogenetics, helped create a syllabus, a program. And Ursula Le Guin and Joanna Russ and Ellison. I mean, just the stars of, I don't know, I'm looking back, it must have been another GIS course, but we were able to find honorarius to pay. And I particularly remember when Ursula Le Guin came, Kane Hall had a concert of gamelan bells from Indonesia, music making. And she was gamelan-like, very thin and lithe and colorfully dressed. And before her lecture, and then again after, she went around and sounded all the gamelan. But Joanna Russ did eventually join the English department. And that was a positive thing. In terms of resistance, I had wanted to keep my name. I told you my mother named me my name, a metric foot, Troki, Anna Pest, Julie, Esther, Coriel. And when I married in 1965, I didn't know I could keep my own name. You don't have to change it. So I went through a divorce, I mean, not a divorce, a legal procedure, found Betty Braceland, who's a labor lawyer, and she said she'd accompany me to court. And I wrote it up so women could do it pro se, by themselves. And we haven't really talked a lot about the environment around the university, you know, there are movements going on, but we started agitating for childcare. And we discovered that the university had spent capital investment on each parking space in Padelford Hall, where Women's Studies was housed, $5,000, 1965, $66. There are a lot of parking lots in Padelford Hall with great views, no childcare. So Seeley, I did change my name, and the lawyer said, well, what does your husband, and the judge said, what does your husband think of this? And I said, well, he's a little nervous, but he's in favor. He said, granted. And Betty said to me, I can't charge you a full fee for this. And I said, well, why don't we split it, you and the abortion birth control referral service? But Celie was really grateful that I was my own name in case I was arrested. It wouldn't come, the news wouldn't come back to oceanography. But it was a time of real turmoil. And I just made a little list. 1969, the murder of Medgar Evers, inauguration of President Nixon, Woodstock, Stonewall uprising, huge anti-war demonstrations, the moon landing, Seattle Black Panthers breakfast program, the American Indian movement occupied Alcatraz, lasted to June of 71, women's liberation. Then again, remember 1970, first Earth Day, Kent State, Jimi Hendrix died, the abortion referendum in Washington passed, EPA and PBS began. Anne and I were constantly irritated. We spent more time together. Judith had teaching responsibilities and didn't attach, but she was there and full of ideas when we needed it. And but we'd be propositioned, particularly by Black students or Black men on campus. And Anne's husband was in social work, and he said, you know, those guys, they just ask, you know, they hit on people, they ask in hope, if you ask 60 people, maybe one will say yes. So that was a kind of armoring against the, I guess they're called microaggressions these days, but just moving around campus.
Well, that's interesting, Julie B. Thank you for that. It also raises a question that I had on my list that I hope we can get to in our last few minutes. Is that, you know, we all address the really interesting and sometimes difficult gender politics on campus, and we alluded to the protests, civil rights movements, and such. What was your experience in terms of the development of ethnic studies, the race politics of women's studies, which has been, you know, in the early days, characterized as not being particularly diverse. So can you recall any of your experience, Karen and Lexi, as students, what the environment was like in terms of maybe collaborating with the Black Student Union, the American Indian students? What were your thoughts on that?
You know, my experience was that we could always look to each other to be allies. I mean, when that thing happened at the aeronautics student, journalist from a student journalist from the Daily, I think it was called, came, you know, heard through the grapevine and came to talk to us. Happened to be a Chinese American man who was an activist who was a friend of ours. And he said, look, I want to interview you, hear the whole thing, but I won't publish it. You know, I won't publish it. But he just wanted to have the story in case it did go public. So he would have it. But that was my experience, was that there were a lot of people who took Intro to Women's Studies who were in those other ethnic studies departments. One story was, I remember we would always have a lesbian panel, and I would be, you know, on the lesbian panel. And I remember one time there was a very religious Black woman, older Black woman, who was in the class at the time, who through the whole class had been talking about Christianity. And at the end of the panel, when we said, okay, we're open to questions, she raised her hand, and I thought, oh, here it comes, you know, we're gonna get it. And she said to us, is there anything that women do in bed with each other that men and women don't do in bed with each other? And boy, that was like the last question I thought I was going to get asked. And I thought about it, and I thought, no, not really. And then she said, well, then I don't see what the problem is. That was, that was that. Yeah, so there were a lot, it seemed to me that there were a lot of people of color, women especially in the women's studies classes, and then were activists. Like I said, all those different groups in Seattle, because they were fighting the same fights we were, you know, to get recognition, to get money, to all of that. I don't know, what do you think, Lexi? You got to.
I agree with you. I think that one of the groups that we haven't mentioned was the Women's Commission. And I wasn't too involved with the Women's Commission, but they were actually more politically active than Women's Studies. I mean, we were studying and they were, and I know they had a lot of interaction with other civil liberty groups on campus. Has anyone looked at Ron Chu's book that just came out, My Remembered Seattle? And he talks quite a bit about the Women's Commission. He was friends with Cassandra Amesley.
Oh yeah.
And it reminded me that you know, there was a lot of collaboration going on there with organizing activities. And I mean, there were certainly, wherever Karen was, there was activity, but the function of Women's Studies was more academic, or supposed to be more academic than it was, you know, creating action, political action. Although I think plenty of political action emerged both then and on into my future forever because of it. But I just wanted to get the Women's Commission in there.
Yeah, in 1978, there was a ballot initiative to destroy the Women's Commission and also to take away gay and lesbian housing and employment rights, a la Anita Bryant. And actually, I'm on a panel discussion for the Women Against 13 and Seattle Committee Against 13. I think almost every women's studies student at that time fought that. You know, we went door to door, made posters, all of that. Yeah, and it was very much a collaborative effort with, at the same time, there was a ballot measure to stop the police from using hollow point bullets. There was also an anti-busing initiative on the ballot. And there was a congressman running who was infamous for being anti-Native American. And so those four groups came together and fought together on those political.
Mary, you would be our last panelist to comment, because I do want to open it up for questions. So go ahead.
Okay, I just wanted to say really quickly that it would be hard to overestimate the importance of the fact that Washington had a referendum legalizing abortion 3 years before Wade v. Roe. We were the only state in the union to legalize abortion by popular vote, and it passed in Washington by 60%. And a lot of us, including me, were very involved in that fight, as were people at the Y. And that led immediately to, and it was funded by OBGYNs who really wanted to be able to help women and were kept from it. And so they then funded giving free sliding scale abortions. And there were a collective of us that was originally started at the Y and included many women's studies people who met women, because the only thing that you had to be, it was actually essentially abortion on demand till 6 months, but you had to be a resident of the state of Washington. So we met people at the bus station and the train station, took them to the doctor. They had the abortion. We took them home to make sure they were going to be okay, put them back on a train, and because we gave them our address. I've, as a joke, sort of thought some social historian someday is going to think there must have been a bordello at Route 1, Box 770, Carnation, Washington, which is where I was living at the time on our family farm. But that was really critical to the beginnings of women's studies. And also the second point is that whether or not we were allied with ethnic studies, which in fact we were very active with the Black students, Black studies in the beginning, the conservative faculty at the University of Washington saw us as one and the same. And there were a series of meetings, people trying to get Don Bell fired and GIS stopped, and they were unsuccessful. But I remember going to those, they were all university faculty meetings. There were like 3 of them. And I was, because I was the acting director at that point, I was intimately involved with that. And it was a scary time. And if we hadn't had the kind of support that we had in the college from the administration, women's studies would have been badly damaged. But there was, and so would have Black studies. I mean, we were uppity students who were doing political stuff, and when we should have been studying, you know, how many angels dance on the head of a pin. I'm exaggerating, of course, but it was a challenge, and it was seen as a challenge by many faculty who were tenured and did not think what was happening with students and these new subjects was a good thing. There was a lot of political contention within the university, and it came back to bite me a couple of times, even in Arizona at Arizona State University. But I just wanted to say that because that was also part of the founding and the very early days of women's studies and Black studies.
Thank you. Julie, I'm going to have to cut us off here so that we
one question,
have,
one comment, Shirley,
questions
about interdisciplinary studies. The edges are where the creativity comes. The UWYWCA, the Women's Commission, the ASUW, these were all points of pressure. The Menopause Study Committee on the teaching of medical school. So I think edges and the interdisciplinary quality.
Thank you. And what talking about interdisciplinarity, one of our questions just came up that some of you might have some insight into is the relationship between the Women's Action Commission and the Third World Commission, Women's Commission at that time. One of my colleagues' students was going through the papers of the Women's Action Commission, and it's starting, I mean, that material is starting to deteriorate, you know. And there's some references to Karen Maeda, the Third World Women's Movement. Do any of you have any memories that you want to share that we can kind of increase our knowledge about? Karen, you're nodding your head. Go ahead.
Sharon Maeda would always come to my class and talk about Asian women, Asian American women. I mean, you know, my memory is shaky, but one thing I remember her talking about was how Asian men were viewed in the general culture as being not, you know, quite masculine, and then how Asian women were seen sexually, you know, as sex objects. You know, and I had never thought about that, even though I'd grown up with Chinese and Japanese people, women. I never had realized that. I don't know. She was great, you know, great activist.
Thank you. Does anyone else have answer that question? Okay. All right. Okay. See, Monica, what else? What do we have any? Well, we're going to open it up for questions, so please feel free. And our panelists can take a breather for a second. Claire.
Claire, unmute yourself.
Unmute yourself.
Okay, since we're taking a little pause, I just want to mention Sue Ellen Jacobs, who was our first tenure line full-time faculty and director. And I want to read a quote from her on the question about ethnic studies and other programs. She says in one of her essays, one of our early goals was to increase the academic and ethnic diversity in our program. Working with Marilyn Bentz of American Indian Studies, Artie Young of Black Studies, James Morishima of Asian American Studies, and Gary Trujillo of Chicano Studies in the 1970s, I sought to ensure that we kept our attention on diversity in our teaching and hiring practices. From the beginning, we have required that our courses contain content on race, class, gender, and sexuality. And she goes on to discuss projects that all these programs worked on together. So certainly within the Women's Studies program itself, there was always some awareness of the need for making those connections.
Thank you, Claire. And for those of you who don't know, Sue Ellen passed away in 2018, I believe. It's now 2017, 2018. Steadfast Women's Studies professor and mentor to many of us. Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Claire. We have a question that just came in with regard to sort of women's organizations in the U District. It was a question of when did the YWCA move from the U District? When I came in 1988, it wasn't in the U District anymore. Anybody like to address that question?
I think
Ooh, I
I can
wish-
address it. The problems were primarily funding and U District rents. There was a succession of directors after Anne Schwieso Hirondale left, Jan Kraus, and then Kate Hunter. And I believe they went to the North Lake neighborhood, right not far from the North Lake Tavern along Boat Street. And they also shared space with the Northwest Women's Law Center. Kate also died about 2 years ago. She was resident in Vashon and continued to fight eloquently, valiantly, tenaciously for women's healthcare rights and rights of seniors. And but I think that would have been early to mid 80s.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, someone just wrote in that it moved to the Boat Street area in 1983. Lexi.
Well, I think that we have to acknowledge that one of the things that happened to the Y was that almost the university Y, all those programs that were born there moved on to have their own spaces.
Yeah. And
so, you know, Aradia had another place to be, and Mechanica, I think, became a new, and so, I mean, there was fewer existing organizations within that, within the Y to sustain it, because they had branched out and started enormously successful programs all over Seattle. So it left the Y kind of floundering to pay their rent.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Our next question, I think, is a really great one, having to do with the Women's Center. What are some of your memories? The Women's Center, of course, still exists. Utapa Basu is still has been running it for at least 25 years now. Do any of you remember your relationship with the Women's Center and the relationship between Women's Studies and the Women's Center? Julie.
Well, it goes back to Dorothy Strawn, because when she was eased out of her job into continuing education, she said, and talking with Alden Bell about women's studies developing in the undergraduate college, she started the Women's Center. And it later became the Individual Development Center under Aline Morris, ALENE MORIS. And there was, frankly, there was tension about it because I mean, if you think about it intellectually, yes, there's the college and there's this opportunity to discuss issues of needs of continuing students, women returning to education, getting started in education, evaluating career possibilities, integrating part-time employment. So there were tensions about it, but it goes back to that questionnaire, the results I collated in her office as a volunteer, that women don't have a recognizable trajectory of passing high school, going to college, graduating, entering the military or the workforce. And women needed support, and we don't have societal support for childcare, whatnot. So anyway, the Individual Development Center eventually split. And then I think Angela Genorio would be a wonderful person to continue the Women's Center. But fortunately, the Women's Center was able to keep a library, and I went to a program with my daughter on how to plan to buy a house. I mean, all kinds of functional, helpful assists in life.
Thank you. And Angela has been, Angela Genorio has been, was a director of the Women's Center for a number of years. Mary, your hand is up. Go ahead. You have to mute yourself, unmute.
I keep trying to unmute myself at the picture and it won't let me. Obviously, I left the area. I finished my degree, my PhD in 1974, and went to the University of Puget Sound as director of their program and professor of history, and left after 1 year and went to Arizona State, where I have been for the rest of my career. So I'm really talking about early days, but part of what happened in the early days, which was sort of background, is that Dorothy Strong, who we've mentioned multiple times, was I think you could arguably say that she was the leading person in the United States for continuing education for women, for bringing women in who had done, like a year of college and then they dropped out because they got married or they had kids or whatever. And the sort of returning women students. The University of Washington at the time that I was there in the early 70s had more returning women students than any university in the United States. And that was directly responsible because of Dorothy Strong. She was adamant about that. And she started the very first scholarships for returning women in the United States. And that, I mean, the fact that we were a state university, of course, made that easier, but women's studies attracted a lot of those returning women students. And I think there's not a women's studies professor in the United States who doesn't say, give me returning women students. They make your class come alive in ways that you can hardly imagine. But that goes back to Dorothy Strong. One of my very dearest friends, Arvella Weir, who died 6 years ago, was the first graduate at the University of Washington who didn't have one credit in college, but came on a full scholarship from Dorothy Strong and took all 180 credits as a returning woman student, and then ultimately got a library degree and worked for the EPA. But that cohort that continued, and that the way that Dorothy Strong had made women at all kinds of ages comfortable on campus was part of what led to, I think, the success of women's studies. I know it may sound a little crazy, but it was really unique. And other colleges, especially state universities, followed it later. But it really was, it was her vision that there were these women out there who had, and partly sort of Betty Friedan's feminine mystique, right, was very much about that. And the University of Washington became an absolute leader in that field It's not unusual now, but it was very unusual then and made a difference to women's studies.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. We have a question from one of our attendees about your own vision for the next 50 years. Based upon your own experiences over, your careers, your lifetimes, what might you envision for the next 50 years of women's studies at UW? Or anywhere, as a field?
I'll go. I would like to see it because I'm not an academic. I have a Juris Doctorate, but I'm not an academic. I'd like to see the connections between the community and the university strengthened, and more to find out what does the community need, from women's studies. What do the community people, need to learn to keep changing the world? And so to have those connections like they were in the beginning of all of this, and not to have it so separate, so that people, coming into the university see the only path being to become academics themselves.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you.
I think we need an enormous, even revolutionary look at education. And I have two granddaughters in my life, and one of them has succumbed to her father's sweet tooth, and she and I have been reading about sugar. We have a society that pushes sugar, high processed foods. We're beginning to see these as addictions. We have a society where fossil fuel industry and the food industries, big agriculture, are shaping policies that are destroying our earth, our planetary resources, species, and resilience. And so how do you tackle these enormous problems? We had the election of a state superintendent of education that said we should have sex education in our public schools. People are not coming out of education systems very widely with critical thinking capacity, verbal analysis. What is truth? Some of the things that really worry me, that there was 31.9% of the elected representatives of this country supported the big lie of January 6th and the insurrection in the Capitol. Almost 1/3 the elected representatives were persuaded, I think, violating their constitutional oath of office. But how are we going to understand these enormous human issues? So I heartily endorse Karen's liaison to, but it's hard to be. John Mercer in 1957 published a paper on rising temperatures, forecasting what we now know about climate change. And he was questioned and denied career opportunities, employment in his field as a result of a very controversial paper. I mean, we have people like Rachel Carson, and Terry Tempest Williams talks about Chris Parker, who bought 1.5 million mineral oil leasing rights in public lands and went to jail for it. I mean, we need to know these stories. We need to charge our enthusiasm and sense of responsibility as a community, as a planet,
Thank you. Lexi. Thank you, Julie. Lexi.
Well, I want to thank Julie too, because what kind of rang a bell for me was when you said we need to know these stories. And I mentioned when I was talking about how I got involved in women's studies, how significant it had been to me to like take a class from Mary and to learn about the suffrage movement, and then later to learn more, to learn the foundational importance of having allies, and knowing that you had predecessors. And I think that one of the things that when I talk to my nieces and nephews and other young students, they're extremely impatient. And I suppose we were very impatient as well. But the truth is, the barge of change turns very, very slowly. And in order to be willing to do the work that you have to do for the amount of time that you have to do it, you have to have a foundation of knowledge of what has preceded you. And you have to have a sense of how to build allies and work with other people. And that's, I think, the most important thing that people walked away from women's studies with, was that sense of not just the facts, but the philosophy that would allow you to go forward and do the work of saving the world. So I hope that women's studies and gender studies, I can never remember the whole title because it's just too long for me, but
Gee whiz.
Gee whiz.
Yeah.
However, I mean, with education, you have to be constantly changing it to meet the demands of the students that you're dealing with, because they come in with different expectations. But the goal, I hope the goal will continue to be, as Karen says, to be linked up and to teach people how to make connection and coalition and community.
All right.
Everyone feels that there are lifelong friendships born of this work. And there is connectivity. Knowledge is power, but if it doesn't have heart and relationship, there's a quote by Jimi Hendrix on the Neptune, when the power of love overcomes the love of power, then we'll have peace.
Right.
But the friendships were indelible and wonderful, and are.
Well, they are, but
yeah.
also, I mean, you can be in a coalition with people that you're not close friends with. We have to reach across boundaries, I think.
Yes. And
Teach
I think
people how to reach across boundaries.
True. Thank you so much. I just want to cascade with the signal of two minutes, and under the webinar system, we have to leave in 2 minutes. So I think I would like to thank everyone, our people who attended, and our panelists for giving us such a rich, multiple sets of narratives and stories about your experiences. I'm hoping that this is one of many of such gatherings that will occur, and I'm hoping that we'll be we can do it in person someday. So thank you.
With food. We need food.
Yeah, we need food. Yeah, we could maybe grill something.
I agree.
Thank you so much for joining us today, and stay well and be safe. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye,
Thanks,
everyone.
Claire. Bye-bye. Bye, Karen. Bye, Mary.
Bye.
Great to see you all.
Bye, Shirley.
Bye.
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 Wonderful to see everybody again.
It was really fun. Thank
Yeah.
you.
So
See you all on
beautiful. You're so
Friday.
beautiful.
See you all on Friday at the Women of Color Collective panel.
Yes.
Join us.
Yes.
You send out that link.
So,
Are you sending out the link, Monica?
Great.
And the time again?
4:30. 4:30 Pacific time.
Yes, all of the events and plus the videos are listed in the website I just sent out one more time. So the GWSS 50th celebrates 50 years link is in the chat, and that has the events, the one on Friday, and also the videos. So feel free to check that out.
All right, thank you to everyone. I hope to see you again soon. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.